So now, we turn to Mark chapter 5, and we're yet in the midst of the lengthy fourth donor council motif of Jesus that concludes the second episode, and I hope we're seeing more and more just how anti-mythological, anti-myth cultural Jesus' pattern is compared with that of everyone around him. Jesus' pattern is clearly inversive and subversive in relation to the pattern of myth culture. It occurred to me that perhaps one reason why the Spirit of God directed Mark and Matthew also actually to make this motif the longest, or the lengthiest portion, is that God really does have so much to give Israel and all nations, so much to teach humanity, that this donor council motif is, of course, the lengthiest. Jesus has many donations and good counsels to offer. Jesus became man to be servant of all, and service is typified by spending one's life, time, and resources donating to and teaching others. So that's what we're seeing here. And in Mark 5 verse 1 then, as you're following along in your Bibles, Jesus and his disciples arrived safely on the far side of the Sea of Galilee in the country of the Gerasenes. Just as Jesus disembarks from his ship, a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit, a demon, meets Jesus. In verse 2, this man has been dwelling amongst the tombs, and we're told that no one is able any longer to bind him with chains. In verse 3, which is a strange yet telling observation. Why would this man live in a graveyard, and why would the local people want to chain him up? He's a demon-possessed man, but we've not heard of this treatment of a demoniac before now, though we've encountered many demoniacs. In 5 verse 4, we're told that the local townspeople used to bind him in shackles, but he would break free and no one could subdue him any longer. So now, night and day, this demonized man wandered among the tombs and the mountains, screaming and gashing himself with stones. Verse 5. So not only was this demonized man demonized twice over by an evil spirit as well as by the local city dwellers, but this man demonized himself, persecuting himself, engaging in what's referred to as auto-lapidation, stoning himself. The evil spirits, his own countrymen, and he himself were all gathered together against him, scapegoating him. This man is imitating the desire of his persecutors, his scapegoaters. He knows that they believe he needs to be bound and punished. Instead of waiting for the community to punish him, he punishes himself to preemptively fulfill their desire. This demonized man helps his community maintain their cyclical pattern of myth culture by scapegoating himself. So I think this is sometimes referred to as an Oedipal complex, as Oedipus cut out his own eyes. But when Jesus arrives, both the demons and the community are scandalized by Jesus' interference in their smoothly functioning cyclical pattern of myth culture. Or maybe the Oedipal complex means something else. Anyways, but Oedipus did scapegoat himself. He punished himself as his community wanted him to. So there's some similarity there. Anyway, in Mark 5 verse 6, Mark explains further that this demoniac, when he saw Jesus, immediately recognized Jesus. Jesus' true identity was immediately known to this demon-possessed man, and he ran up and immediately bowed down before Jesus. Astonishingly, only the crazy and demonized man is able to see the truth clearly, to accurately identify and acknowledge Jesus as the Creator God. His disciples, as we just saw, weren't sure. They doubted. They were afraid and didn't appreciate who Jesus was, even though he demonstrated with such power and in confirmation of biblical prophecy. Once again, this is evidently also an effect of the demon possession of the man. We've seen many times before now that demons know exactly who Jesus is and say so openly. And as I say, the demon's immediate recognition and bowing down before his Creator God, who is Jesus, is in stark contrast with the unbelief of his own disciples, who've watched everything he's done and heard everything he's said and still don't get it fully anyways. Even though they're following Jesus, they don't really know who they're following. They don't fully believe in who they're following. And then the man, and or the demons within this man, cry out to Jesus and say in verse 7, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." Jesus is explicitly identified as God, as Jesus is given the divine epithet, Son of the Most High God. And this again reinforces Jesus' distinction. And the evil spirits are not Jesus' rivals, but his subjects, though they're rebellious in nature. So the opponents are not his equals. And in myth, there's an equality between these gods. It's not sure who will win. But as we've seen from the beginning of the gospel accounts, Jesus is clearly described as the high God from the beginning and as not having any real rival, because everyone else is a created being except himself. So this pleading of the demons shows that they're scandalized by Jesus' presence there, continuing this scandal episode for the opponents of Jesus. So now we look to see how Jesus will diffuse this scandal. Will he participate in the scandal, or will he diffuse scandal? Mark tells us that Jesus has already begun exercising his full divine authority, commanding the evil spirit in the man, saying, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit," in verse 8. Jesus demands to know the demon's name, and it replies, "My name is Legion, for we're many," in verse 9. And the demon pleads with Jesus again, acknowledging Jesus' authority by asking not to be sent out of the country, in verse 10. In response, Jesus insists on donating to the possessed man his freedom, but seemingly grants the legion of all the demons their request, giving them permission to enter into a great herd of swine, about 2,000 in number instead, in Mark 5:11-12. And once they've entered into the pigs, they race down the hill into the sea and begin to drown, in verse 13. And of this event, Yarbrough Collins, another scholar, writes that Jesus has outwitted the demons, not surprisingly, by allowing them to enter the swine. Apparently foreseeing that the swine would go mad, Jesus has sent them into the sea. The sea is symbolically equivalent to the abyss, and the abyss, or Sheol, is the home of the demons. Yarbrough Collins' comments, interesting observation. So seeing all of this, the swineherds run away and report these events to the city and surrounding country, so that the people come out to see what happened, in verse 14. When the Gadarenes see the until recently possessed man sitting down, clothed in his right mind, they're frightened, in verse 15. So there's unexpected forms of fear here. The disciples were afraid when they were saved, even more afraid than they were when they were in mortal danger. Here, the Gadarenes are frightened not so much by a demon-possessed man running around, but by him being hale and whole and well again. That's the really terrifying things. What is it that frightens you? Well, when you have a deluded, irrational population that's in the clutches of a myth, inert in their myths, they're terrified by the truth. They're terrified by the truth. And we're seeing that today. The really terrifying thing is not that the government is in a totalitarian and dictatorial way taking all of our rights and freedoms away. No, the real terrifying thing is a minority of unvaccinated people who are no threat to anyone refusing to go along with that evil. That's what's scary, right? So here again, the mythological world is terrified by truth and order and peace. They want violent sacrifice. When it's explained to them by the swineherds that Jesus has done this to the man and the pigs, in verse 16, they're even further scandalized, pleading with Jesus to leave their region, in verse 17. The reason for Jesus' scandalization of the Gadarenes appears to differ from that of Israel's religio-political leadership and the people of Israel generally. Rather than being scandalized by Jesus' so-called blasphemous self-identification, as in the case of the religio-political leaders of Israel, this predominantly Gentile, non-Israelite population of the region of Gadara are scandalized by Jesus' terrible power and by his crippling of their scapegoat mechanism in their myth culture. Jesus is happy to diffuse their scandal by again creating space, social distance, and boarding his boat to leave in Mark 5, verse 18. So we've seen Jesus not participating in the pattern of myth and scandal again, but consistently opposing it, diffusing it, and showing them a radically different way. Liberation from myth and lies and violence. The man whom Jesus set free asked to be with Jesus, but Jesus gives him a mission instead and tells him in verse 19 to go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. And the man does so throughout Decapolis, there east of the Galilee and the Jordan, proclaiming what great things Jesus, the Lord, had done for him, so that everyone marveled, in verse 20. And Yarbrough Collins notes the exchange of Lord with Jesus in these verses. It's an important observation to see, which reiterates Jesus' identity as the Lord God incarnate. So Jesus' donation of freedom to the man is shared in good counsel to all that region. Jesus returns by boat to the other side, the Israelite side of the Galilee again, and a large crowd gathers again around him by the seashore in Mark 5, verse 21. While there, a ruler of the synagogue named Jairus approaches Jesus, falls at his feet, and begs him to come and lay his hands on his dying daughter so that she will be saved and live, in verses 22 to 23. Yarbrough Collins notes Jairus' obeisance to Jesus and his words indicate complete confidence or faith that Jesus has the power to heal his daughter. Jesus goes with Jairus to donate healing and life to the girl, and a large crowd follows and presses in on him, in verse 24. And while on the way to heal this dying daughter, some woman, in verse 25, who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, whom no physician could help, no surprises there, verse 26, but had heard about Jesus, came to him in the crowd and touched his cloak, in verse 27. She was saying to herself, if I just touch his garments, I will be saved, in verse 28. And when she touches Jesus' cloak, her blood flow immediately stops and she's healed, verse 29. Jesus immediately perceives that power proceeding from him had gone forth when she touches his cloak, and so turns around saying, who touched my garments, in verse 30. His disciples are surprised that he asked this, since many are pressing into him, in verse 31. He's being jostled by a great crowd of people, but he asked who's touching him. Everybody's touching him. Well, Jesus sees the woman, however, who trembles and falls before him and tells him the whole truth, verses 32 to 33. And Jesus says to her, daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction, verse 34. Jesus seemingly did not plan or intend to donate salvation and healing to this woman, but her faith, her trust in Jesus, won it for her. In Mark 4, we learned that if a person will not receive Jesus, become his follower, then he cannot receive his counsels, his word. Likewise, we learn here in Mark 5 that if a person will not believe in Jesus, then he cannot receive his donations, his healing and resurrection. This message continues Jesus' fourth inversive and subversive donor counsel motif of this second scandal diffusion episode. While Jesus is still speaking with a woman, people come from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, and say, your daughter's died. Why do you trouble the teacher anymore? In verse 35. But Jesus says to Jairus, do not be afraid. Only keep on believing. In verse 36. Jesus would let only Peter, James, and John go with him to the house of Jairus, in verse 37. Just those central three apostles. People were weeping and wailing at the house of Jairus, in verse 38. Jesus goes in and says, why do you make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep. And they laugh at Jesus, in verse 39. Jesus puts them all out of the house, takes the girl's mother and father with his 3 disciples, and enters the room where the child is, in verse 40. Though this careful selection of companions seems to relate to the woman with the flow of blood, and that the crowd pressing Jesus were not saved and healed except the one who believed. Similarly, the crowd at the house laughs at Jesus, but the Father believes. Jesus will only allow those with faith in him to be present for this miracle, perhaps because it affects the outcome. This reading is confirmed by what happens next at Nazareth in Mark 6:5, as we'll see. But taking the child by the hand, Jesus says, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up, in Mark 5, verse 41. And immediately, the 12-year-old girl gets up and walks, and the parents and disciples are completely astounded, verse 42. Their faith evidently did not diminish their astonishment. Once again, after donating healing and life in response to faith, Jesus orders the witnesses to keep the matter quiet, continuing to diffuse scandal over his identity and power with privacy, one of the techniques we've noticed. And he says that the girl should eat something in verse 43. Jesus expresses practical concern for donations for the basic physical well-being of people, such as food, in addition to their spiritual well-being, and that's important to see. This won't be the last time that Jesus commands others to feed the hungry, to donate toward the needs of others as he himself donates in imitation of him.